83, flipping heck, that's fast. Okay, so for those of you that have used Zoom before, where are you all from? Let's have a look. Let's see whether people can find the chat. Can people do it? So I've put, hi everybody. Oh, hey everybody. Where are you all from? Oh, Derby. Wow, excellent. Hello. Hi, Deb. Hi, Jennifer.
All these. Dumfries, Dorset again.
Maria, Sarah.
It's so fast, I can't read it.
Kulchuma.
Oh, there's quite a lot of people from Dorset.
Excellent. Oh, hello, Bradford. Somebody's just said.
Blackburn. Inverness. Fabulous.
Excellent.
Salford.
London.
Excellent. Derbyshire, Halifax. Another one from Bradford. Hi, Georgina. Hi, Neil, Deborah, Vicky. It's going too fast. It's too many.
Canada. Southampton. Plymouth.
Canada. Wow.
Oh.
Portsmouth. Excellent. Wow. So
348 with us at the moment.
Should we give it a go then? Yeah. Hello everyone, a warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining in our second of a series of webinars on reflection in social work. To all of you that joined last week, thank you so much for providing your feedback. It was a huge success and it's enabled us to join in with practitioners, social workers and students all over the world. We are amazed and thrilled with all of you that have joined in and watched the YouTube video after. For those of you that haven't met me, wasn't joined in last week, I'm Mary and I studied the BA Social Work at Anglo-Ruskin University, Chelmsford, and I'm currently working at Essex County Council in the Children and Care team awaiting my registration. So we do hope that this introduction to reflection is helpful, and I'm now going to hand you over to Kelly to introduce herself and the rest of the team.
Ellie, you're muted.
Over to you,
Sorry everybody. Sorry everybody. Right, I've unmuted myself. Okay, so like Mary says, my name's Kelly. Still learning to use Zoom, as you can see. I am studying the BA Social Work at Bradford Uni. I'm in my first year, just about to come to the end of my first year. I'm kind of getting geared up for year 2. So that's me. I am doing the co-hosting with Mary, so you might hear from me again, you might not. I will introduce each of the team in turn. They will tell you what uni they're at, what course they're doing, and then we'll hand over to Siobhan for the content. So I just want to introduce somebody from the tech team. So I don't know whether you can see his name or not, but we've got Omar, who is in the background, clicking things, approving things, letting you all in, being really helpful on Twitter. Omar is also in his first year. He's doing the BA Social Work at the University of Birmingham, and he may be on later or he may be on a future webinar, but that's Omar. So I will hand over to Becky to introduce yourself, please, Becky.
Hiya, I'm Becky. I'm just finished my second year studying at the University of South Wales, so I'll be starting my third year come sort of September, doing the Bachelor of Science in Social Work.
Excellent, cheers for that, Becky. Next up, we've got Chris to introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Chris. I am living and working in North Dorset. I'm studying the BA in Social Work with the Open University. I'm in my final year, approaching the end of my last placement.
Excellent, cheers, Chris. Next up, we've got Kat to introduce yourself, please.
Hi everybody, I'm Kat. I also live and work in North Dorset and I'm studying with Open University BA Social Work course. I'm currently completing my final placement in older adults and have 5 days left before I then transfer over to Children's Services.
Excellent, cheers for that, Kat. And then next up we have Siobhan, but just before I go to Siobhan, I just want to cover some things for you. A few of you have mentioned, can we see you? We cannot see you, we can't hear you, so get yourself a cup of tea, get yourself a biscuit, whatever you fancy. We can't see you, just relax. It is being recorded, so if you check the YouTube channel in a couple of days or so, after Siobhan's done the editing, it will be on there. Everybody who's registered and has taken part tonight will get a certificate. That's fine, that will be emailed to you. We do have a member of our team, Kerry, who will type up the chat just with any recommendations, any links for things, any resources, that will all be emailed to you. if you want to ask a question during the night, it might get kind of lost in the chat. So at the bottom of your screens, you might be able to see a little Q&A box. So if you type your question in there, that will get passed to Siobhan, and we will have regular kind of slots during the night where Siobhan will be able to answer questions, and that'll be passed on by Kat. We do have a hashtag for tonight, so if you want to take part afterwards or during, or you can't use the Q&A, you can hashtag on Twitter, and that is hashtag Student Connect. So we've got Becky and Emma who are kind of interacting on Twitter, and I think that's it. So yeah, we can't see you, don't worry, just relax. So that's enough from me. I'm going to pass over to Siobhan, and then we'll get started with the content, the thing you're all here for. Thanks, Siobhan.
Hey, thanks for that, Kelly. So Kelly and Mary, are you going to switch your mics off now for a minute, just to make sure there's not too much background noise? I'm conscious that certainly for those of us who are in the UK, there's thunderstorms going on everywhere, so hopefully people won't lose connection tonight because of that. But you've been introduced to all the students on our Student Connect team. But my name's Siobhan McLean. I've been a social worker for 30 years, and my passion is making theory and reflection accessible for practitioners and students. I'm currently a practice educator and work a lot in learning and development in social work. So tonight we are going to be looking at reflective practice. My slide doesn't seem to be moving, Omar. I don't know if I need to do something. There we go. So tonight we're going to be looking at reflective practice. What we're going to try to do with these webinars is alternate. So one week we look at theory and another week we look at reflection. Tonight is very much an introduction to reflective practice. So whatever issues you raise with us during the evening, we'll look to do some future webinars, perhaps on reflective supervision or reflective writing, for example. But tonight we're going to be looking at the stages of reflection, the spaces of reflection, and the structures of reflection. So for the first webinar, I've chosen those 3 words, and they all begin with S: the stages, the spaces, and the structures. What I'm going to ask you all to do now and throughout the evening is think about any other words that come to your mind that start with S but relate to reflective practice. So if there's any word that comes to your mind now around reflective practice but beginning with S, stick it into the chat, and Chris will let me know what they are as the evening goes on. And all of the panelists we've got tonight from the Student Connect team are also going to be asked that question later, and they've not seen the presentation, so we'll see what kind of words beginning with S all of us come up with. But the key thing about all of these 3 things, the stages, the spaces, and the structure, the thing that connects them is not that they begin with S, although they do, but the thing that connects them is another word beginning with S: skills. We need to develop our skills in reflective practice, but the way that we do that is to think about the stages of reflection and the spaces that we reflect in and the structures we use to help us to reflect. So the presentation tonight is going to be broken down into those 3 areas. We're going to start off with looking at stages. And in terms of stages, there's 2 things that I want to look at. The first is, when do we reflect? And that's the stages, if you like, of reflection. But the second one is also about stages, but it's stages of development. So the second one is our expectations about reflection and reflective practice in terms of the stage of your career. So we've already heard, for example, Kelly and Omar are at the end of their 1st year, Becky's at the end of 2nd year, Kat and Chris are coming up to the end of 3rd year, Mary's already completed her course. So everybody on the panel is at a different stage of their social work training, but I know that we've been joined today by practice educators, by social workers returning to practice, and social workers who've been around for as long as I have, and the expectations are different at different stages. So we're going to look at those 2 things in terms of the stages of reflection. But as this little image here demonstrates, in terms of growth, then there are 3 stages, and there's 3 stages of reflection. There's also 3 expectations. These are separate, 2 separate things, but they both have 3 parts to them. So we're going to start off by looking at traditionally the stages of reflection. So this is, when do we reflect, if you like? This is the question around when does it happen? And Sean, I think you pronounce it Shern. I'm a bit northern, so I still say Sean. He, in 1983, wrote what's now seen as a seminal text on reflective practice called The Reflective Practitioner. Not about social work, but about all professions, really. And he said that there were 2 stages of reflection. He said that we reflect in action, which is reflecting in the moment. So as we're doing something, reflecting. I'm reflecting as I'm giving this presentation. It's really difficult for me because normally I'd be with a group of people and I'd be looking around the room and seeing whether people are nodding and listening and what's engaging people. So I'm reflecting through looking at the panelists and how they're engaging and what they're thinking. So we all need to be reflecting in the moment, and we do that by observing what's going on around us, by looking at body language of people, by gauging atmosphere, that kind of thing. We reflect in the moment. What do we think's happening? What's working well? What isn't working well? All of that's going on as we're doing something. And then Siobhan said there's also reflection on action. Now that's what you do after a piece of work. So let's say you've done a visit, or let's say you've had a virtual conversation on Microsoft Teams or something with a service user. After that piece of work, you look back at it and you think, what worked there? What didn't work there? What might I change if I did that again? That's you kind of looking back. So what we've got there is during and after. But quite a long time later, about 8-9 years later, Killian and Toddenham added a 3rd stage of reflection, which is less commonly talked about in social work, but is a really key aspect of reflection. And they called it, to use the same kind of phrasing of Sean, they called it reflection for action. Now that's the reflection that we do before a piece of work. So before we're doing this webinar, we all join together for 20 minutes before you come in, and we talk about what are we going to do, and we reflect on how do we think things are going to go. That's reflecting for action, reflecting before. Then we're all reflecting now as it's going along, and later we'll all look back, what worked tonight, what didn't work tonight, what will we do differently next time. So we've got these 3 stages of reflection. And effectively what that does is it's the stages of social work. Plan something, do it, and then review it. You've got these 3 stages. So actually what we should be doing is reflecting all of the time. But I've noticed in teaching about social work and in some of the things that I do with local authorities and universities, I've noticed that I think the reflection for action stage is almost, if you like, the missing component. It's often not talked about. People are very aware of reflecting in action and on action, but not so aware of reflecting for action. But what I have noticed, I'm doing quite a lot of virtual reflective supervision at the moment, working with people who are home working during the pandemic and so on. And what I've found is social workers are definitely reporting that they are reflecting for action a lot more. And I think it's almost like if you've got very used to something, you've been doing a particular thing for a long time, then you just do it. You get a referral, you just run out and do it. But because we're now having very changed times of working, we're having to reflect more ahead of doing something because we've never done it before. It's the first time we've done it like this, so we have to think ahead of what we're doing. So I think there's a lot more reflection for action going on, which is good because, you know, that phrase that I've put up here on the slide, which you can attribute to so many different places, but failing to plan is planning to fail. If we don't plan our work effectively, it doesn't work well. And so we must reflect before we do something. And as a practice educator, I've always been very conscious that students need the opportunity to reflect for action a lot more perhaps than experienced workers because students are doing things for the first time. But I have noticed, and look, it looks on the poll here, 75% of people are saying they've also noticed an increased use of reflection for action recently, which is interesting. And the final point that I've put on this slide is for those of you who are students. Think about your direct observation paperwork. Obviously, I don't know every single university's paperwork, but most universities have paperwork around direct observations where you have to say something before the observation. What do you think you're going to do? What are you planning? What kind of theories do you think you're going to use? And then you write about the reflection afterwards, looking back. How did it go? That's about encouraging you to both reflect for action and on action, as well as in action. So what we've got is these 3 stages are really important. So there, if you like, the when we reflect stages. But the second part of stages that I want to talk about before we'll take a little break in between each of the 3 S's and see what people are saying in the chat and what questions you might be asking. But the second aspect of stages is about career stages. So what I want us to look at now is the stages of our career and how we grow and develop. And my slide's not going again. There we go. So what we've got is we've got these career stages. And in social work, we use the phrase reflective practice to cover 3 related but very distinct aspects of reflection. So what we've got is, as you can see there, I wondered afterwards whether I should have called these the steps of reflection rather than the stages of reflection. So I've done it as a little staircase here. We've got reflection onto critical reflection and onto reflexivity. Now, I would say if you, as a practice educator and talking to others, if you look at certainly the standards for social work training in England and Wales, which is the standards I'm most familiar with, the expectation that we would have there as practice educators is that by the end of a first placement, a student is consistently reflective in their practice. They'll be reflexive some of the time, but you're looking for consistently all of the time them to be reflective. By the end of a final placement, you're looking for a student to be consistently critically reflective in their practice. And by the end of a first year in practice, so an ASYE or first year in Wales, you're looking for consistently the worker to be reflexive in their practice. So these are all connected, but they are 3 different things. And so I want to just run through my understanding of what those 3 different things are so that you can for yourself gauge, are you at the level that you should be in terms of these steps? So reflection, I suppose, is all about thinking actively, thinking persistently, exploring your thoughts, your insights, your feelings, your values, your ethics, your learning. And as I've said, it's not just with hindsight. It's not just looking back at what worked well. It's also in the moment, and it's also before you do something. So it's that whole rounded way of being thoughtful and reflective in doing what you're doing. When we go on to add the word critical, this becomes really important because I don't think this is always very clearly explained. What's the difference between reflection and critical reflection? And I know lots of students will say to me, they get feedback on their assignments that say, you're not being sufficiently critical in your thinking. You've not got critical. And then people think, well, what do we mean by critical? And often I think there's a misunderstanding here. And people sometimes think of when we put the word critical in, it must mean looking at what didn't work well. It must mean looking at being critical of ourselves. And I understand why people think that because of the word critical. They think it's maybe critique or something, criticism. But actually, in social work, when we use the word critical, it means power. It's all about power. If you think about critical race theory is all about where does power lie in relation to race. The word critical is power. Critical theory is power theory. So actually, critical reflection adds in issues of power and the socio-political context of practice. That's really what it's all about. It's power dynamics. And it also goes into more depth. than just reflection. It goes into depth to enable you to make change in your own practice and in what's going on in the world, if you like. So critical reflection is all about change, power, and understanding the political context in society. So then the third stage that we would be expecting you to be working towards at the first year of practice. Now, there'll be pockets of you doing this even in your first placement, but you won't be expected to be doing this consistently until you're in your first year of practice as a qualified worker, and that's reflexivity. And reflexivity is something that originally comes from the world of research. And what reflexivity does is it adds on a layer. If you like, each step we go up, we're adding on to what came before. So we're adding on extra bits. Now we begin to add on issues of relationships and the interconnections between what's going on, connectivity. And the connections isn't always totally apparent. You have to be reflective to see how does that connect to that? How does this connect to that? The key aspect, though, of reflexivity is the centrality of yourself. It's understanding, how did I understand what was happening there? How did I see that? What impact did I have on that piece of work? How did I do it differently to the way someone else might have done? So it's about that circular nature of, how did I impact on that piece of work, and how did that piece of work impact on me? It's that whole circular nature. Now, I'm not spending a huge amount of time on this, but actually this is something that's really important for you to get a hold of during the early stages of your social work career to make sure you're getting at the right step of reflective practice. So I have done a YouTube video on this, which goes into quite a lot of detail about the difference between each step and how to make the move to that step. So that's as much as I'm going to do on that, because you can follow it up if this is something that you're interested in to follow up yourself. We're going to move in a moment on to spaces of reflection, but before we do, I'm just going to ask if there's anything in the chat or if there's any questions. So we'll take a pause for a moment at this point. And I'm also going to ask the panelists if there are any words beginning with S that they have thought of. So is it okay if I go to Chris first, because Chris is monitoring the chat tonight? So is there anything in the chat, Chris, that I need to be aware of or know about? Or
I think most of the questions have gone into the Q&A. Yeah, there's a comment about critical reflection. Is that not just being the pros and cons of the situation?
No, it's not really. The critical is that bit about power dynamics. So you should be exploring, where does power lie here? So if you're thinking about decision making, whose power is, who has the power to make decisions? Whose interests do those decisions serve? It's really digging into and delving into the power dynamics within a situation.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Okay. Any S word you've thought of, Chris? Give me an S word.
Yeah, I spent a bit of time thinking about this, and for me, reflection can be a bit of a spaghetti in my mind, and it takes me a little while to kind of get it all untangled and making sense, and I often find that I sleep on it and my subconscious makes sense of it all overnight for me, which is very helpful. So I thought for me, spaghetti was a bit of a good description of how I feel sometimes.
Lovely, thanks for that. Well, you've actually come up with 4 S's there, because you've done sleep as well.
Oh.
Set, spaghetti and subconscious, so there were 4 S's there.
Oh, well, there you go.
Thank you. Okay, Kat, are there any questions I need to be answering here? Or
yeah, there's a few questions that have come in. So somebody has asked if it's possible to get stuck in the for action stage due to the increased risks and uncertainty, and how do you move out of that?
I think that's I don't know who asked that question, but it's a brilliantly insightful question, that is, because I think it is easy to get stuck there. And actually, do you know, it links back to what Chris has just said about spaghetti. There is a concept called reflexive spaghetti, which is that you get yourself tied up in reflection. You reflect on something, then you think, well, I'll do that. But then you think, oh, but what about this and what about that? And you end up tying yourself up and almost overthinking something. So actually what you need to do, and we're going to move on to this later, is at each of those stages of reflection, it must lead to action. So your reflection for action must lead to action. And you almost have to get to yourself to a point of thinking, I've thought this through as much as I can, and I've analysed the risks, and this is the action that I'm going to take. So you have to ask that final question at each stage of, what action am I going to take?
Okay. I hope that's answered that. Another question that's come in is, how do you match up your academic stages with your career stages? So moving from the different academic levels and becoming from a new student to a more experienced student.
That's an interesting question. I don't know if I'm fully getting what that might mean, but I suppose this slide that we're looking at now can help you there, really, because it's first year, final year, and then on into a kind of level 7, academic level 7, which is your ASYE year or your first year. And really, I think it's something that it's about practice. The more that you practice, the better you get at reflection. And I think some people are very good at reflecting in their practice world, but not reflecting in academic writing. So I don't know if that's partly the question as well, is how do we match up our academic writing with our ability to be reflective? And that's a very specific question that we'd need a whole webinar on, but I'm happy to do a whole webinar on reflective writing, because I think it's something that's really important.
He's agreed that it is something that we should do a whole webinar on.
Okay, well, we will. And what's your S word then, Kat?
Oh, I was originally thinking of self, but I've seen that that's come up quite a lot. So I will go with 6, the big 6.
Oh, the 6, the big 6.
Yeah.
Oh, I've not thought
Here you go.
Thank you. Yes, the big 6 model.
The big 6.
Thank you for that one. It's a specific model. Okay, so Kelly, can I come to you and ask you your S word?
Yeah, my S word is not a word, but it's so what. So I like to use the model of reflection that goes kind of, what happened, so what, and now what. So just to kind of keep that like reflection on how is it actually relevant, like for next time or for practice. And I find that helps. So what.
Okay, great. That's a really good word. Thank you for that one, Kelly. Mary, can I come to you for your S word? You need to put your mic on, Mary.
Oh, there I am.
Okay.
When I think about reflection, I think of strength, as when you spend a little time reflecting on how your strengths interact with the world, you can better understand how they work. So I was looking at it in that way.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mary. Becky, I'm going to come to you later for your S word. Is that okay? Is that all right? Okay. People will see why in a little while, why I'm going to go to Becky in a short while. So we'll go back to the presentation now. And what we're going to look at now is spaces of reflection. So here we're going to look at the second of the S's that were in the title. I'm going to look at where we reflect. So I suppose in a way, stages relates to the question, when do we reflect? And this S relates to the question, where do we reflect? And you know, that diagram there shows social workers know about how important space is, you know, because we take a person and environment perspective. We look at the person that we're working with in the context of their relationships and the community they live in and the society that we all operate within. So in just the same way as that illustration kind of starts to show the person and environment perspective, we should take a social worker in team, in organisation, in government perspective in a way, because it kind of fits like that. So we need to think about the spaces in which we reflect. And here, I'm going to tell you a bit about some of the research that I've been involved in, but there's also going to be a poll here that Omar's going to put up so that we can see whether this research is still there. Over a number of years, I've asked social workers, what's the most common space that you reflect? And there's been 3 really common spaces that people have said. The first one is the car. Top one is always the car, and that's getting the top one on this poll now. Always the first place people say is the car. The bathroom was very common. In the shower, people said in the morning before going to work, in the shower or in the bath. Bed. Often people said bed. Now, they've always been, whenever I ask groups of social workers, what's the place you reflect? They're the top 3 spaces that come up. I would love to think people would say, oh, in the office or in supervision or at work, but they don't. And look, that poll has come up with exactly the same thing. You know, a lot of people maybe on a walk outdoors. So the spaces of reflection are still those very common spaces. So a couple of things that worry me about that. And one thing that I'm going to suggest for you, and when we send you the resources that go with tonight's webinar, we'll send those out to you tomorrow. We're going to put a link to Harry Ferguson's latest blog, which he did for Research in Practice, which was about the need to find new thinking spaces now. As we're working from home, the car as our main source of reflection has been taken away from us. We're not in the car very much anymore. People used to say that they would reflect in the car on the way to a visit and on the way back from a visit, and driving. That Harry Ferguson calls it a transitional space. It's that where we move from one place to another. So we move around spaces, and as we're moving in that transitional space, that's where we reflect. But it's been taken away from us, and we need to think about, where are we reflecting now in current practice? You know, and Harry Ferguson says we need to find new transitional spaces to enable us to be continually reflective. But something that is really worrying me a lot at the moment around that reflection is the impact of us working from home. Because if you think about the way in which trauma and space are connected, the place where trauma happened is something that everybody remembers. If people have experienced trauma, that they understand the context of space. But even if you've not, then that phrase where people say, do you remember where you were when you heard about, different generations have a different thing. So do you remember where you were when you heard about JFK is an older people's generation? Or do you remember where you were when you heard about Princess Diana? Or different contexts. And that demonstrates how space and trauma are connected. And I'm really concerned that at the moment, social workers are working from home without that transitional space. They are hearing about trauma on a daily basis in their own space. I did some reflective supervision just today with someone who said, I've been working in my conservatory through the pandemic. She said, it used to be my favourite room in the house. She said, after all this is over, I don't think I'm ever going to want to come in here again. Because it's she's heard all of this really difficult, traumatic stuff in that space. And how is this going to impact on us long term? I'm also conscious that, we're bringing social work into our own homes and our families. How do we avoid that secondary traumatic stress kind of impacting on them? I remember years ago working late one night, sitting writing a report, and my daughter, who's now grown up, I think she must have been poorly, and I picked her up and put her on my knee, and I was still trying to type this report, and she'd just learned to read. And I remember her saying to me, Mummy, what does that word mean? She'd read it on the screen, and I realised at that point, I can't do this anymore. I can't work while she's sat there because she's going to read this stuff that's traumatic. So that trauma is being heard in our own homes now. So this reflective space is so important, more now than it has ever been. It gives us, working from home, also gives us a lack of situated learning, especially, and this is really important for those of you who are students and new workers. When you're on placement in a team room, you learn from what's going on around you. You hear someone have a difficult phone call and you learn how they deal with that difficult phone call. Or you learn when somebody comes in, they've had a difficult visit, you can pick up on that and you'll talk to them and people get support. We've not got that now because everybody's working in isolation. So a lot of that's gone, and it means that reflection becomes even more important. And I believe very strongly that social work employers and social work educators have to step up at the moment, and they have to provide us and help us as social workers to find and create reflective, emotionally safe working spaces for us. And I think that's something that's very important, allowing us time to reflect. I've heard social workers who say their managers are saying to them, well, now you've not got to drive about, you can take on more work. Well, actually, where's then our reflective space? We really need to think about this as a profession. It's essential. So that space thing also connects to reflection with. Now, this is, we talked earlier about reflection in, on, for. This is a different concept. Reflection with is something that I wrote about with two colleagues, Jo Finch and Prospera Teddem. And reflection with is all about the importance of reflecting with other people. And that's the bit that I'm worried we're losing a bit at the moment. And it's partly why we're doing these webinars, to help us to all get together and reflect together. It's really important to reflect with others and to share reflections with other people. So at this point, we're going to try out something that we're hoping to follow up each week. And we're going to, this fabulous Student Connect team here that I'm working together with, and I'm loving and I'm learning so much from them. We're going to put a different person in the spotlight each week. And the reason I didn't ask Becky earlier what her S word was is because tonight, Becky is going to be in the spotlight. So I'm going to hand over now for a few minutes to Becky, and she'll perhaps tell us what her S word is, but she'll also tell us about her thoughts around reflection so that we can learn together with students. So it's over to you now, Becky. You're in the spotlight for a moment.
Okay, cool. So it's quite lucky in a way then that my S word was supervision, because I think for my second year placement, I really needed the supervision that I had from my practice educator, and I really needed to work through everything that I was experiencing and going through. I think going into my placement, I thought that reflection was easy, and I thought, oh, I can do that because that's the personal bit. So I thought that was easy. I thought the academic, the theory stuff, that's hard, you know, so that's the bit that I've got to work through. My placement sort of changed all of that really, because the first couple of reflections I wrote after my direct obs were just rubbish. They were just really bad. And I didn't think they were really bad when I was writing them, but my practice educator kind of had to come back and go, but they're very descriptive, Becky, and what are you going to change? You know, what's going to happen with all of this? You've got all these ideas and stuff, but what are you going to do? So I really had to work hard at the reflection with action stage, and in the end I got there, but it meant battling systems, especially, you know, where I was, so it's another S word, but I had to battle a few systems that were quite ingrained and were quite tough to work around, but in the end I kind of got there. But yeah, I think I think that was you know, a big change, because you've got to look at yourself, and I kind of went into this with my social work head on as well, thinking, well, you know, I don't discriminate against other people, and, you know, I'm not oppressive. But then the placement where I was, I actually was quite discriminatory. I did have some feelings like that, and I had to really address and challenge them in myself and turn it around. And you don't like to think that. You don't like to think that about yourself, I don't think. So yeah, so that was my kind of S's, and yeah, that was a big part of my reflection journey.
Yeah, and I think it is a journey, isn't it? I think it's a good way of putting it, a reflection journey. It is a journey in reflection. And, you know, I think the other thing you've highlighted really well there, Becky, is we learn a lot about ourselves from reflection, don't we? And sometimes it is about opening yourself up, and sometimes we don't like what we see. You know, it's almost, in a way, it's like looking at a reflection in a mirror, because you don't necessarily like what you see when you know, when you explore yourself. But I think that's you know, it's really, and it's very interesting, isn't it? Because we didn't know what the S words were going to be. I said to you, I don't want to know what the S word is, and you didn't know what the presentation was going to be. But the fact I'm saying it's all about reflecting with others, and you saying the importance of supervision, really connects that together. So
there's a question that's come in. They're just asking, Becky, where your placement was, if you're able to share that.
I was in the prison system, so I was working across 3 HMP prisons across Wales. Yeah,
Thank you.
Quite fortunate. It wasn't something that I necessarily asked for. It even crossed my mind. But yeah, I was working with a third sector charity based within 3 prisons, so that's where the systems comes into it. There was a lot of systems.
And a lot of power dynamics there that could be explored in that.
Yeah, a lot of discrimination, a lot of oppression. It was, and that's what I mean when I had to look at myself, because not in a million years when I started the social work degree, I thought about maybe working with children or with families or with, a whole heap of people, but I didn't for 1 minute think about how I might feel when I was inside a prison working with individuals.
Yeah. Thanks very much for that, Becky. And thank you for being the first student to go in the spotlight on our webinars. I'm going to encourage everybody, we've written it down there. Becky wrote an article which was published very recently. Actually, it's another S, isn't it? Because it's the University of Sheffield, I think it's based out of. It's a project looking at social work during the COVID-19 pandemic. And Becky wrote a really good article called The Professional Curiosity Cake, which is a really good article about reflection. So again, we're going to send people the link to that tomorrow, and I'd encourage you all to read that and think about where Becky is at and what she was talking about in that article. So thanks for that, Becky, taking the spotlight today. You did great. And the other thing that links, I think, connects what Becky was saying there, it connects both what I was saying before about reflecting with others, but the other aspect of reflection with is the importance of making change, bringing about change. So if we add reflection with action, then that's all about making sure that when you reflect, you think about taking action and bringing about change, which is what, Becky said her practice educator was asking us. So I think, the question that we often see it in models of reflection about what could you do differently next time, that's why that's really important, because what would you change next time? But you could also think about, what could I encourage others to do differently next time, and what could just be different next time? And that would explore the power dynamics and the systems and the how can we challenge systems that Becky was talking about, for example. So in all of that, what I'd ask you to do is just note the focus there in that reflection with and bringing about change. Note the focus on difference, because we're asked so much, what could you do differently? What could be different? And people often come into social work saying, I want to make a difference. And that's a great reason to come into social work. It's an absolutely great reason to come into social work. But I have a friend who I do quite a lot of work with, and one day I'm hoping he'll perhaps come as a guest on a webinar. But he says he's not a social worker, but he has experience of growing up in the system. And he says it's really important that social workers don't just make a difference, but actually social workers need to be the difference. And that's really important. Actually just try and be the difference. Don't make a difference, it's be the difference. And we all have the power to be the difference in a person's life. And that's really important. And if ever you get the opportunity to take a look at some of Yusuf McCormack's artwork, it's absolutely fabulous artwork, expressing how it feels to be a child in the system. So we're going to move to the next S, unless Chris or Kat have a specific question or piece of chat they want to share. You don't have to.
I do have a couple, actually. It's going back a little bit. I've had a few questions asking about how you deal with the impact of bringing the difficult situations into our lives and our homes, as we have during the current pandemic, and also how you move forward as a practitioner if you're dealing with trauma within supervision.
I think it is a really important question, that, Kat, and one that I can't give a full answer to here, but what I would say is next week's webinar is all about theory as it relates to the pandemic, and part of that I'm going to look at theory in terms of our practice, but I'm also going to look at theory in terms of ourselves, and I'm going to explore some of that. I'm going to explore the concept of moral injury and how to mitigate moral injury and how to recover from moral injury, which is that big thing about trauma-informed supervision and thinking about ourselves. So I will come back to that question, but not till next week, if that's okay.
That's great, yeah, thank you.
Okay. Chris, is there anything specific you need me to know, or you don't have to, but just if I can't see the chat?
Not specifically, no. But one thing that really caught my eye earlier when people were putting in their S words into the chat was somebody described it as swampy lowlands. And I just thought,
yeah.
you know what, that is such a great description.
Yeah.
And hopefully tonight is helping to make them a bit less swampy.
That's a really interesting. I love the word swampy.
I know, it's great, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay, fabulous. Okay, so we'll go on to the third of our S's for tonight then, and look at structures. And if I'm honest, really this is looking at models of reflection, but I wanted to keep it around S's. And so when I was thinking about the title, I thought, well, these are really the structures that we use to structure our reflection in a way. Models are what we use to structure reflective writing, to structure our thinking. And so we're going to look at models of reflection a little bit in this part of the webinar. Now, one thing to be very aware of is there are two types of model of reflection. There are process models and there are component models. Now, we could almost spend a whole webinar looking at that and the difference, and I will happily return to, this is an introduction, and I will happily return to any of these things to explore them in more depth for people. But again, I have done a YouTube video on this, what's the difference between a process and a component model. But essentially, one really easy way is to connect this back to the stages of reflection. And a process model can only be used after something has happened. It's a model you can only use in hindsight. So it's a model that nearly always will start off with the question, what happened? So obviously you can't use it till something's happened. So a process model can only be used when you're looking back. Whereas a component model can be used at any stage of reflection, because essentially what a component model does is just say, think about these things. It just gives you a kind of, in a way, a list of things to consider. So Kat, for her S earlier, mentioned the big six. The big six is a component model of reflection because it just says, here are 6 things you should think about when reflecting. And it is a really good model to use to reflect on a situation after you've done it, but you could also use it to reflect before you've done something. So you've got different models of reflection. A component model can be used before as well as after. I think, therefore, this is a very personal view, but my view is component models are often better for social work, especially if you're writing a direct observation. Because if you're doing that, writing something before about how you're planning it as well as after, if you use a component model, you can compare your thinking before and after using the same components. We can look at this more if people want to, but you need to tell us that in the chat, and then we can arrange another webinar to go into more depth. But there are these 2 types of models, process models and component models. And you need to be aware that different models of reflection suit different people, and they also suit different circumstances. And so you need to have familiarity with a range of models. Don't just use the same model of reflection over and over and over again. You wouldn't use the same model of intervention with every family over and over and over again. So don't use the same model of reflection. But what I'd say is, look around for different models, and I'm not going to tell you which one will work for you because different ones will work for different people. But I, as a practice educator, remember a long time ago now working with a student. She was a fabulous student in practice, probably one of the best I've ever worked with in practice, and she could talk reflection brilliantly. But when she had to write it down, she just couldn't write it very well. And up to the point where I started working with her on a final placement, I think her highest mark had been in the 50s. And we put a lot of work into writing reflectively because that's an important skill really for your future as a social worker. And she only had one assignment left to write when I was working with her. And she wrote that assignment using a component model of reflection she'd never come across before, but one we used on placement. And she got 80% in that assignment. She went up. Now, don't come back to me and say, oh, I changed my model of reflection and I didn't get a 30% increase in my grade. Don't, you know, but it worked. It worked for her, and it can work for different people. But you've got to find the model that works for you. So tonight, I'm going to share a couple of models with you. But what we could do is a webinar and looking at lots of different models if people would find that helpful. But tonight, I'm going to go through just 2 models. And what I'm going to share with you is that there are process models and component models, as I said, but you'll see the structure picture has changed here because I've also added in self-created models. And that's what we're going to look at in a bit more detail tonight, is self-created models. This is a kind of plea, if there's any social work academics out there or lecturers in reflective thinking, then as a profession, this is really important. We have to be aware of where the models we use come from, and we must be conscious now more than ever, but always, I think, of the very Eurocentric, gendered nature of the models of reflection that we teach and use. There's a poll coming up now, I think Omar's going to pop it up for us now, around what models of reflection you have been taught in your university studies. So just have a look up there at the list of models that I've put, and just put what model of reflection you've been taught, and we'll go for it. I have already written down on my slide what I think is the most common model of reflection that is taught, certainly in UK universities, but we're going to see this live as it goes on. So we've got already, 326 people have voted, and it's going up all of the time now. So we're getting votes in on this all of the time. And look, what I can see now, 92% of the people who voted have been taught Gibbs. 92%. We've got to recognise that that model is, it's been around for years. It's nearly 50 years old. It's written by a white man who's not a social worker. It doesn't come from social work. Let's start to challenge this. Let's start to look at mixing up some of the models. Why are we teaching models that are predominantly from white middle-class academic men that does not reflect the diversity of social workers or the diversity of the people that we seek to support? And the models of reflection must be usable, must be accessible, and also need to be diverse, and they're not currently diverse. So the list of models are put up there. Most of them are men, most of them are white, most of them are, you know, it's only really Jan Fuchs who writes quite a lot in social work around critical reflection. So I get passionate about this stuff, but it's really, really important, you know. And most of these models that we're using, a load of them come from nursing. So many of the models of reflection that we use come from health. And that means that in a way, they're encouraging a medical model of reflection. And the other thing to be conscious with, that at this point, that then connects us back to the starting point of, if you like, the steps of reflection, is if you look at other professions, they talk a lot about reflective practice. Teachers have to train on reflective practice. You know, police officers have to do training on reflective practice. Engineers do training on reflective practice. Nurses do. All professions do training on reflective practice, but not critically reflective practice. Because it's us that should be looking at power dynamics and social justice and bringing about change and all of that. The models we're using don't take us towards that. There is a lack of those key issues in social work, such as the person and environment perspective, such as a consideration of power dynamics in those models that are being taught. So let's really start to challenge that. Let's start, you know, as a group of professionals to say, let's look at models that come from social work. And some of the best models of reflection I have ever seen are those that are created by social workers. So in my work, when I get the opportunity, and it's a great privilege that I'm missing at the moment, but to do face-to-face work with social workers, particularly students and newly qualified workers, one of the things I do is I get them to develop their own models of reflection. So I do some teaching on, here are the standard models that are, you know, we go through Gibbs and we go through Born and we go through some of the standard ones. And then I say, right, now develop one yourself. And some of the best I have ever seen come from those sessions where people develop models for themselves. And my slide's not moving again, there we go. And these are created in half an hour. Gibbs is quoted as saying it took him 20 years to develop his model of reflection. These are done in half an hour. And I would say to you, they're better than Gibbs, and he took 20 years, and these are done in half an hour. They are brilliant. I post them all the time on Twitter. So whenever I've done a session with people and they come up with something on flip charts, and you can just see some of the flip charts here, I'm always posting the flip charts. I am amazed by what social workers come up with and how good these models are. The other thing about these models is they're usable, they're relatable, they're accessible. You can use them in direct work. You can use them when you're working with people wanting to bring about change. We need to support the people we work with to be more reflective, to bring about change. Social work is about supporting people to make change. We've already said reflection creates change. So these models are those that you could use in direct work. They're brilliant. You know, think about creating one yourself, or look to some of those that have been created by others. And there's places you can find them, and I'll tell you a little bit about them. But I've picked out two that I specifically want to do with you. And I've picked out these two, one because it's incredibly popular and people know about it now all over the place, but one because I mentioned it to this group of Student Connect gang, and they said, oh, we've never seen that. And I said, I'll show you that one day. And so it's in the webinar tonight. They haven't seen it before either, but I mentioned it to them. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is the weather model. Now, the weather model was originally created by a small group of students. I was their practice educator. And one of the things they said to me in a group supervision, I used to do group supervision with them, and one of the things they said to me was, there's not as much reflective conversation in the team room as we thought there'd be, Siobhan. Now, this is like 15 years ago or something. It was a long time ago. And so if you were here last week, you'll know my way of problem solving is what, why, how. So I said to them, okay, well, what is discussed in the team? Because that's my starting point. And they said, there's two things you know are going to get discussed in the team every day. One is the weather, and the other one is food and what people are eating. And actually, if you think about your own teams, if you're in a team room ever again, then the two things that are talked about in every team is food and the weather. So I said, well, you know, develop a model of reflection then using those topics. And they developed two, one around food and one around the weather. And then they decided as a group of students, they would use the weather that they'd created. And this is how it went. What they did was they got 4 flip charts and they drew a sunshine on one, a rain cloud on another, fog on another, and lightning on another. And they associated they only did 4, but each of those 4 pieces of weather, they associated with a question. So on the sunshine flip chart, they put what's working well. And on the rain one, they put what isn't working well, and so on. And they put those flip charts around the room, the team room, and they asked their colleagues, they said, bless you, Kat, I saw you sneeze, and they said, when you come back in from a visit, and if you've been, you know, something's gone well, stick it up on the flip chart. If you think something's not gone well, stick it up on the flip chart. And then it brings a bit more reflection into the team room. And it worked brilliantly. And that team, 15 years later, I still have connection with that team, and that team still use the weather. They talk about a weather watch in their team meetings. So they still use the weather. They love it as a model of reflection. And I started to talk about this when I was doing training and very first started to talk about self-created models, and people loved it. And they asked me, we want to reference this. We want to use it in an assignment, so we need a reference. So I wrote an article about it in a couple of places. The Professional Social Work, the Baswa magazine had an article and so on. But now I've got to tell you, over the years, I have now completely changed the way that I use this model. And one of the reasons I pulled this model out is to show that how we change on reflection, but also because I know lots of people who are coming to these webinars are students and newly qualified workers. And where something like Gibbs that you've all been taught can be a useful model, to reflect on a single incident, it's not good to reflect on a period of time. And very often, if you're on placement, you're asked to do a reflection looking back at the whole placement. Well, Gibbs isn't going to help you with that, because the first question Gibbs asks is, what happened? Well, you can't, you'll write a whole dissertation about what happened, because hundreds of things have happened. So this is a really good model to use for a period of time. If you're doing a first year in practice, very often you'll have a review after 3 months or something. Use this model to prepare for that review. It's brilliant. If you've got your mid-placement meeting coming up, use this model to prepare, because it's so good. So I've used it with students, and this is why I've changed the way I use it. I used to use it with every student. At the end of placement, I'd say to them, let's look back at your placement. Let's look at what the weather was like. Tell me about the sunshine moment. So tell me about what was the best part of your placement. And then I'd say, tell me about the rainy moment. So tell me what didn't go well on the placement. Tell me about fog. So tell me what couldn't you see and when did the fog lift. So I used to use every bit of weather and associate it with a question. So I'd do the weather and then I'd follow it up with a question. And about 2 years ago now, I was doing this with a student, and I always make the notes during this discussion. And I was making the notes, and we'd got so far, and I can't remember which bit of weather we'd done, maybe lightning, which was always what came as a surprise to you or what shocked you on the placement. And I was still writing that up. And I said to her, the next question we'll go on to is the snow question. Now, it's quite ironic, because I'd always attached snow to what could you see differently, because when it snows, you can see things differently. But I hadn't finished writing down. So all I said to her was, we'll do the snow in a minute. And I was still writing. And she started to tell me about what had been the most fun for her on the placement, because to her, snow meant fun. And straight away I had a light bulb moment and realised I've got this model all wrong. I shouldn't ask an associated question, because everybody sees the weather differently. Some people love the snow and some people hate the snow. Some people don't like the sun. So why would you say the sun is what went well? So now I don't do that at all. Now I just say, tell me about the sunshine moment of your placement. And some people have told me about what went well, but some people have told me about when they got sunstroke halfway through because it was so busy. And some people have told me when they got sunburnt. And I'll say, tell me about the rain. And some people will tell me about what they didn't like. And some people will tell me about when they felt like they were drowning in puddles. I mean, it can be anything. And it works really well to reflect on a period of time. But I'll tell you how this is also brilliant. It's great for doing direct work with people. Just the weather, asking questions around the weather. It works brilliantly. I did try this actually with my daughter when she was home at the beginning of lockdown, and she's an engineering student. And she had to write a reflective account. And I always become very popular in my family. If anyone has to write a reflective account, I'm always very popular. And I just said to her, well, you know, let's have a talk about the project that you've got to write about then. And I just used the weather. I just said to her, what was the sunshine moment of the project? What was the rain moment of the project? It worked brilliantly for her, and she's not even a social work student. So we ended up just videoing a little bit of that conversation and putting it on YouTube so people could see how it works. So again, if you want to, there's more information on YouTube. I'm passionate about that model. It was developed by social workers, by students. It's brilliant. It's a great model for students and newly qualified to reflect on a period of time. And none of the traditional models give you a reflection on a period of time. They're generally about single incidents. And then the other model that I want to share with you, which is a self-created model, is the Disney model. Now, this model was created by a group of newly qualified social workers, and you can see that they had very good art skills. They clearly had someone in their group who could draw really well. But they came up with this, and it's kind of a reflection on your first year in practice, but it's also just a model of reflection. And it's based around Disney characters. And now I'm not a Disney expert, and I know some of this isn't Disney, but you don't pick us up on the exact Disney bit. You'll get the idea. It's a great model. It starts off with the yellow brick road in the background, and they said this represented the fact that when you're a social work student, you're almost told, like, you're going to qualify, you'll see the Wizard of Oz. When you qualify, you see the Wizard of Oz. But then when you qualify, then you're told, well, now you've got to do an ASYE year, and then you can see the Wizard of Oz. And then you're told, well, now you've got to do your CPD, and then you never see the Wizard of Oz, because you've got to reflect forever. You've got to continue to develop forever. So you're never going to see the wizard. There's never an end to reflection. That's kind of in terms of our career journey. And then along the yellow brick road, they've put characters from Disney movies that represent what reflection means. So the first one, you've got mirror, mirror on the wall. How do I look to the service user? It's really important. That's self-awareness bit. Mary Poppins says, in every job to be done, there should be an element of fun. So what are my values? Why did I come into this job? Why do I want to do it? The fairy godmother represents emotional intelligence by asking, how do you feel? But also the fairy godmother represents miracle thinking and change, because she was able to change a pumpkin into a carriage. So what could you change? What could you do differently and see differently, and so on? Then I think, is he called Rafiki, the Lion King monkey? Apparently he has a famous phrase that the past, I can't see it on screen now. The past can hurt you. You can either run from it or learn from it. Where does my wisdom come from? How am I using my past in what I'm doing? How am I learning from things? Then Princess Fiona from Shrek represents, do I know what I'm letting myself in for? Am I thinking ahead? Do I know what I'm doing? And then finally, the fish from Finding Nemo represents the importance of constant questioning, asking yourself why, what if, next time, when, where, that whole constant questioning. That was done in 25 minutes. Now, I think that's just a brilliant way of thinking about what reflection is. So I'm going to encourage everybody to say, create your own model of reflection. Think about it visually. If visual thinking helps you, think visually. And when you think visually, it really then helps you to be reflective. So they're just two models of that social workers have created. So we could do lots of other webinars. This has very much been an introduction to reflection, using the 3 S words that we started off with, the stages, the spaces, and the structures of reflection. And it's very much an introductory webinar tonight. But I don't know how many S words we now have in the chat box, but I'm just going to, I had a quick review. How many S words did I come up with when I was thinking about tonight? I don't know if anybody wants to take a guess. Maybe some people in the chat. Have a guess how many S words I came up with, and this is the number of S words. And I am now that the panelists have come up with S words, we could add those, because I came up with 49, and we've already had lots of S words from the panelists that I didn't have, and from the chat that I didn't have, so it's gone over 50 already. There's my S words. When I look at those, you know, we literally could do a webinar on each of those. You know, we could do a webinar on how to involve different stakeholders and take feedback from stakeholders and include that in your reflection. We could do a whole session on supervision reflectively. We could do a whole session on understanding the socio-political context, or subliminal messages, or slip-ups, and why do we only reflect on what doesn't go well, and all of those things, as well as sleep and spaghetti and the subconscious and so what and swampy and all the other S's that have been added. So there's loads of S's that we can use. Tonight was very much an introduction to reflection. I would love it if people would put in the chat, or maybe email us later, about what you'd like to see another webinar on reflection really drilling down into, because reflection needs to go into depth. And tonight we've not gone into depth. Tonight we've done a surface. There's another S that I've not added. Tonight we've done a surface of lots of issues in reflection. So, and one thing I'm just going to say to you now is Emma, who isn't here tonight, has been really good at advocating for students with me all day today. Emma and I think Becky as well are both involved in the Student Hub, on which is, I've been amazed by, on Twitter. I think you've got now, Becky, more than 1,000 members already. And Emma's been trying to lobby today for, can I get a discount for Student Hub people? So she's lobbied and managed to get a discount. You have to use, this is what you have to do. She's told me, and she's going to put it on social media tonight, apparently. But you have to email me, because I've got no other way of doing it, with the discount of HUB, HUB 5, and then you get £5 off the reflective card price. So it ends up being £30 inclusive of postage from us if you do that in the next 24 hours. But if you want to develop your skills in reflective practice, these cards are very different to theory cards. There are 52 of these. They're full colour. They've got about 30 different models of reflection. And just as an example, one thing I would say, if you're writing an essay, a reflective essay, sit down with 3 or 4 different reflective practice prompt cards, and they will prompt your thinking and enable you to write your assignment. I know people love the theory cards. If I'm honest with you, in my own practice, I use the reflective cards much more than I use the theory cards, although I know the theory cards are popular. Maybe it's just because I need more support in reflection. I'm a bit of an activist, if I'm honest with you, so I always use the reflective cards in my own practice. I'm going to put the, just one moment, Kat, because then I'll come straight to you. I'm just putting the references that I've used tonight up on the screen, and that's the end of my presentation, so I'll come to Kat, any questions and so on, but so that you've got all of the references for the material we've talked about tonight, that's there. So it's over now to Kat for questions and Chris for chat and anybody else who wants to share anything. So.
I've just had somebody ask, you're putting a discount obviously through the hub for the reflective cards. Are you also doing that for theory cards as well?
I don't think we can do that for theory cards. We already work on a not-for-profit basis, so Emma's really so I'd have to look at that. I don't think so, but we may be able to do a discount on if you buy both sets together. So if you email me with Hub 5, has to be in the next 24 hours, I can look at what we can do. If you want a double set of cards, so both cards together, or just reflective cards, I can do something, I'm sure.
Lovely. We've had a lot of people.
Sorry, Kat.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry, I think my sound's going. I think the storm must be coming. I was just saying we've had a lot of people just thanking you really for being able to put across the different types of models in a simple way, because a lot of people have used them before, but actually now after you've discussed them, they really understand them. Okay. And they've been able to think about different ways that they can utilise them as well within working with different service user groups.
One thing that I'd say, and again, it's maybe just something I'm particularly interested in, but it could be a really good webinar, is there's a really excellent model of reflection by Korsken and Vassilos, the reflective onion. And that can be transformational in people writing reflectively. And that's definitely, if we were to do a webinar on reflective writing, I would definitely be talking about that particular model of reflection. I think really enhances people's reflective writing, but obviously we couldn't do all the models tonight, so
that's great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Chris, is there anything come up in chat that we need to know?
No, I don't think there's anything extra. People were wondering where to email, so we've put the email in there, webinars. Okay, at the website, so that's okay. Lots of really positive feedback though, people saying thank you so much for putting this on and how much they've learnt, so they're looking forward to the next one.
Okay, it would be good just for, we're going to do them alternating, so one week will be theory and another week will be reflection. So if you tell us what you would like, I know what I think would be good, but it'd be good to know from you what webinars you want. Next week, same time, and we're going to, this time, because this student group are working so hard for all of you out there, because I'm not able to do everything, I'm not able to answer all the emails and things, and they are working so hard. I can't tell you, I am so incredibly impressed by this group. But rather than you keep emailing us saying how can we register, because it takes us a long time to reply, when we send the email that Kerry, who's at work tonight, so not able to be here, but Kerry's going to take the notes and send those out to you all tomorrow with the resource links. She will give you the link for the next webinar. So if you can use that rather than emailing, because this group are getting inundated and they've got their placements to finish and things. So if you can, that's how you'll be able to join the next webinar. And next week, it's going to be about the theory that relates specifically to pandemic pandemic practice, and I'll be doing that in relation to work with service users but looking after yourself as well. So that's our session for next week, and we'll have a different student spotlight next week to look forward to as well.
We've also been asked quite a few times about when people will receive the certificates. So just say that everybody that's attended tonight will receive their certificates within the next 48 hours from the team.
Okay, that's fabulous. Thank you. You honestly mustn't underestimate the work that this student group are doing on your behalf. It is incredible. So on your behalf, everybody who's here, I would thank them because they are doing a tremendous job. All I have to do is prepare the presentation and turn up. This group do everything behind the scenes, which is brilliant, as well as Omar, who we can't see but is doing all kinds of very clever things in the background. So it's 8:20. I'm sure people have lots of things they need to get on with, and I think we're concluded for the evening, are we, everybody? Are we happy? So thank you very much to everybody, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. So bye-bye.